I am now going to turn the time over to Fiona Givens, who is going to introduce our guest here tonight, Dr. Laurie Maffly-Kipp. So, Fiona.
Oh, you were lovely. Make me feel special. Well, it's really important that Reed Nielsen just entered the room because he's part of the story that I'm going to relate. I don't know if you know that he's managing editor or director at the history department, but is shortly to become mission president in Washington, D.C. North Mission. So that's very exciting. I met Reed and Dr. Laurie Maffly-Kipp on the very same day. I think it was Reed who invited us to Laurie's class, and I was so impressed by this professor, by her kindness, students' concerns, and I thought, what would it be like to be instructed by a professor of her ilk? And so it is my privilege to welcome her here this evening. Laurie Maffly-Kipp is the Archer Alexander Distinguished Professor at Washington University in St. Louis's Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. She is currently a visiting fellow at Brigham Young University's Neil A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship, where she is researching international Latter-day Saint history, huzzah. She has previously served as president of the Mormon History Association. Her publications include Setting Down the Sacred Past, African American Race Histories, Religion and Society in Frontier California, and co-edited collections such as Proclamation to the People, 19th Century Mormonism and the Pacific Basin Frontier. Her teaching and research focuses on African American religions, Mormonism, and issues of intercultural contact. Please give Dr. Laurie Maffly-Kipp a very, very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. That was more than I deserved, I'm sure, but I appreciated your kind words and well remember your time in Chapel Hill when we met. Before I start, this is the first opportunity I've had since in the 20 years that I have been studying about the Mormons as a non-church member myself. It's the first opportunity I've had to speak in front of the person who actually first introduced me to Mormonism. And I know, Terry, you're probably going to hate me for doing this to you. But and some of you have heard this story, so I thought it would make sense to introduce Terry. Terry was one of my best friends in high school and is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I used to go to church sometimes with your family and got to know your family well. So that was my first introduction, came really through Terry, her mother, her father, and seeing the kind of wonderful family life that they had. So Terry, I want you to stand up. And I want to give you a round of applause. It's a very small world, yeah. So it's a great pleasure to be here and a real privilege to present this lecture in honor of Eugene England. I never met Professor England, but in doing a little bit of research about his life and legacy, I felt an immediate sense of kinship with him, beyond the Stanford connection, especially with his commitment to academic inquiry as a necessary and healthy part of a life of faith. It brought to my mind the words of Rabbi Joey Rosenfeld, "All questions are a form of prayer." All questions are a form of prayer, in that they express our desire to seek ultimate truths in our own lives. I've also benefited greatly in my own scholarship on Mormonism from reading many, many articles in Dialogue, a journal dedicated to questioning as a crucial aspect of devotional life. And for all of those reasons, I am in the debt of Eugene England. I was also delighted to read that in 1954, Eugene and Charlotte England were called on a mission to Samoa. Now, much of my own work on Mormon history has dealt with missions in the Pacific Basin, from Hawaii to New Zealand. And so I eagerly read through his essay, Mission to Paradise, describing that experience questions about class, power dynamics, and race that it raised for them. It is a sensitive and illuminating reflection on what it meant to be a young missionary couple. And he included several vivid stories about Samoan women they encountered that resonated with the themes of my talk this evening. So in the spirit of curiosity and questioning, let's turn to Mormon women. This is a woman's church. How many of you recognize that phrase? This is a woman's church. You heard that before? For those of you who haven't, I'll tell you a little more about it. It was introduced by Sharon Eubank at an address she delivered at the Fair Mormon Conference in 2014. Sharon Eubank is currently the first counselor in the Relief Society General Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. At the time, however, she was, and still is, Director of Humanitarian Services and LDS Charities. Here is an excerpt from that speech that she gave. I am going to tell you a story, she started, and it actually happened to Lillian DeLong, a friend of mine. She served on a Relief Society board years ago, and she was assigned to go to Ghana, and she had her husband with her, and they were in a very rural part of Ghana. So they did their training. She was there to do Relief Society training. And it is a very simple structure, and they were in different rooms, and her husband was in priesthood, and she was in Relief Society, and they did their training. After it was over, a woman came up to her in her beautiful Ghanaian church dress, and she shook her hand, and she kept saying, "This is a woman's church." She's just crying, and tears are just streaming down her face. She kept saying, "This is a woman's church." Lillian didn't really know what she was talking about, and she's smiling and saying, "Yeah." But the woman just kept pumping her hand and saying over and over again, "This is a woman's church." And finally, Lillian said, "What do you mean this is a woman's church?" And she said, "We have just been in the marvelous Relief Society that teaches us not only spiritual things, but temporal things about how to make our lives and our children and our families better. And at the same time, your husband is in the priesthood room, and he is teaching our husbands that the culture of the church does not allow for them to beat their wives and their children." Eubank's story was celebrated with a standing ovation at the conference. It was later posted on the Mormon Newsroom's website and reprinted in the Ensign magazine. The excitement with which this address was received, according to one observer, is unparalleled by that of any address given by any other speaker at a Fair Mormon conference. Now, there are several reasons I think that this address was met with such an enthusiastic response and embrace by both attendees and later by church leadership. First and most obviously, it is not a good thing to beat wives and children. That is something that I venture to guess most of us would agree on. And the knowledge that church teachings had some effect on ameliorating this problem, and to hear that stated in such a moving way from the Ghanaian woman, undoubtedly provided listeners with confirmation that the role of the church in other parts of the world can be salutary in some pretty fundamental ways. But I would venture that some of the pleasure of this story comes from the surprise of that ending, when the woman says, "Relief Society teaches us not only spiritual things, but temporal things about how to make our lives and our children and our families better." Now, at this point, many hearers might be nodding in agreement. Yes, they might think. It teaches us how to manage family finances, how to serve the poor, and how to bake funfetti donuts or serve a waffle bar brunch. Now, my point is not to make light of or diminish the importance of these kinds of Mormon corridor activities, which also include exemplary humanitarian projects and fundamental building blocks of mutual support for women in local wards. It is simply to register the shift in the last sentence that likely runs against our expectations. And at the same time, your husband is in the priesthood room, and he is teaching our husbands that the culture of the church does not allow for them to beat their wives and their children. That final statement startles with the awareness that this is a very different world from that of cookie exchanges and service auctions. Church meetings here are a life-sustaining force. But I believe the story is also surprising for another reason. There is a sizable number of white North American Mormon women who question whether the LDS Church is hospitable enough to women's voices and experiences, who likely are surprised by the idea that women in Ghana might see the church as a liberating institution. These groups of critics do not speak with a single voice. Instead, we can hear their concerns ranging from advocacy for women's ordination to the priesthood, to those gently seeking more gender equality and a greater sphere for women's input into institutional leadership. There is a wide spectrum of ways in which women who desire more of a voice, who want the LDS Church to be more of a women's church, to express their dissatisfactions and press for change. One illustrative reaction was expressed in an online comment from an American woman on a blog site after she had read through Sharon Eubank's story. She remarked, "I am so glad this woman is seeing improved treatment of women in her life and community because of the influence of the church. Most of the world is considerably more plagued with female mistreatment than the United States. But at least one reason for her relief and comfort appears to be the stark contrast between her cultural and her religious experience as a woman. Women in America go to church and experience a contrast, but in the opposite direction. I recognize many American female members are not pained by the male-oriented nature of the current church. But I, for one, walk into church and feel nearly suffocated by culture shock, utter shock at how little women are utilized, recognized, conferred with, and so on. I don't want the church structure to feel like something a woman ultimately outgrows once she finally recognizes and honors her true worth. It's wonderful that the church is helping women in third world countries learn it's not acceptable to beat women and children with their fists, but women still feel beat up by the patriarchy in the capital state of our religion. Now, all these examples and differing reactions raise the question, what does it mean to be a woman's church? What does it mean for women in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to make their lives and children and families better? The anecdote about the Ghanaian woman and reactions to it should be all the proof we need that women in a global church do not all have the same experiences of life and family that can yield a single answer to these questions. Do we really know what the Ghanaian woman meant by calling the LDS Church a woman's church? Now, my goal here this evening is quite simple. It is to broaden our understanding of potential answers to that question by utilizing some healthy curiosity about how flexible that definition might be. Put another way, and rendered in LDS speak, that question might run as follows. How broad can the church tent be with respect to women's experiences? How broad can the church tent be? I would suggest that so far the tent has remained relatively small, or at least the realm of what might be considered as women's experience has been limited. Now, this is understandable historically. It was only a few decades ago that North American women did comprise the majority of women in the church, and thus their experiences, shaped by U.S. cultural norms, were taken as the model for all Mormon women. But there has also been considerable resistance, not just to change itself, but to admitting women's voices into the shaping of decisions. Colleen McDaniel's recent book, Sister Saints, describes one of the first attempts to survey women's experiences in the church around the globe. In the early 1990s, Relief Society President Elaine L. Jack and her two counselors, Cheiko Okazaki and Eileen Clyde, conducted an international survey of the Relief Society. It was quite an ambitious and thorough undertaking. They directed stake Relief Society presidents to organize 12-person focus groups to answer questions about their experiences in the organization. They also encouraged women to suggest changes and improvements. What they discovered, however, was that women didn't actually discuss the Relief Society. Instead, they focused on women's concerns and the gap that many of them felt between church ideals and the reality of their lives. One woman apparently reported that she simply didn't go to church, quote, because what they tell me about myself, it's just too painful, unquote. To report back to the church, President Jack, Okazaki, and Clyde planned a General Relief Society conference in fall of 1995 that would celebrate the diversity of women's experiences and family structures that were anchored within the faith. 2 weeks before the meeting, Gordon B. Hinckley called them into his office and advised them that they would need to change the theme. He instructed them that they should instead address the traditional family and not demonstrate the many kinds of families within the church. It was at that meeting that President Hinckley presented The Family, a Proclamation to the World, a document that has since become a dominant statement of gender and family norms in Mormon discourse. None of the Relief Society leaders had been consulted ahead of time about the document. And indeed, in later years, both Okazaki and Clyde expressed their frustration in not being consulted in the process. Diverse voices have been muffled, but not entirely stifled in official church settings. Jack, Okazaki, and Clyde all managed, in their own addresses to the General Relief Society that fall, to name some of the disjunctions between the reality of women's lives and church ideals that they had uncovered in their survey. In her masterfully cheerful way, Okazaki first thanked President Hinckley for his inspired words. Quote, "We all have a clear vision of the ideal gospel-centered home, and the women in the church work toward that ideal, yearn for it, pray for it, and rejoice in it," she said. Yet she continued by noting that mortality brings with it experiences of both good and evil, so that we may learn from our choices. Quote, "And many of these experiences are painful. In most congregations of sisters, even in hearts and homes in apparently ideal circumstances, there are hidden heartaches and taxing challenges. At least some among you are survivors of abuse and other crimes of personal violence. Death or divorce can visit any home. In your family, or in the family of someone close to you, is someone dealing with chronic mental, physical, or emotional illness. Chemical dependency, financial insecurity, loneliness, sorrow, or discouragement? Many sisters are in second marriages with the triple challenge of healing from the loss of a first marriage, working to build a strong second marriage, and compassionately providing part-time mothering to children of the husband's earlier marriage." Okazaki thereby acknowledged in her words the realities that she had charted in the survey, while still honoring the value of the scripted ideal. It was kind of a brilliant performance. I can't believe she packed so much into those few sentences as she did that. In this case, then, female leaders in the U.S. have been frustrated by a male leadership that promotes a female ideal and is less comfortable with the messiness of real women's lives. Even this, though, is still an ideal centered on North American Mormon women's narratives. Remember that this story told by Sharon Eubank was delivered in the service of a lesson to North American English-speaking Latter-day Saints. And this is most often where the conversation of both feminists and traditionalists begins, with the assumption that all saints share the same ideals for what womanhood and family should mean. A brief perusal through the Fair Mormon website did not yield many, if any, talks by Mormon women from other places. A panel discussion in 2013 on, quote, "Seeking Sisterhood Among Different Perspectives on Mormon Feminism" included 5 prominent LDS women, all very accomplished, and all US-based. Similarly, some of the most prominent pro-family organizations led by church members, including Latter-day Saint Women's Stand and United Families International, both of which defend a traditionalist reading of the Proclamation on the Family, including women's roles, are exclusively staffed by white, US, and mostly Utah-based leaders. The website of United Families International has a section devoted to what it calls World Family News, and the contributors, from what I can tell, are all North American and white. Although my research is nowhere near as extensive as the surveys undertaken by Jack, Okazaki, and Clyde in the 1990s, over the past several years I have visited female church members on 5 continents in an attempt to discern what their faith and the church, not necessarily the same thing, their faith and the church, mean to them. And my work has also benefited from some wonderful collections of oral histories and accounts gathered from around the world, some of them by people in this room, in fact, that give some glimpses into the lives of female saints in other places. These histories, collected by researchers through the Mormon Women Project and the Mormon Women's Oral History Project, are beginning to reveal a much broader array of experiences and opinions than has been previously captured. So in the time I have remaining, I want to sketch out some of the contours of this women's church, as well as the challenges it presents. Now, if we return to our Ghanaian example, it's tempting to see the global differences in women's experience as purely a matter of economic development. If the church can just help women become self-reliant and productive, then they too can work toward the same ideals of womanhood as their North American sisters. And it is true that women in many parts of the world look to the church for the basics of education and a community safety net that is otherwise not available to them. But research suggests that there are other cultural issues that complicate this formula, and even the meaning of self-reliance is more variegated than one might think. Take, for instance, the example of Europe. There, the differences in women's experiences are not primarily economic. Still, many LDS women in Europe see the ideals presented in church settings as more American than Mormon. Corrine de Koe van Velkenhuizen, I hope I pronounced that right, I don't know how to pronounce her name, she reflected on her move from Antwerp to the Mormon corridor in the early 2000s. Quote, "I thought I had a Mormon identity until I moved to Utah," unquote. It was only in that move that she realized that Mormon female identity was not universal. From her perspective, Utah Mormon identity was routinely conflated with right-wing conservatism and Republican Party politics. Her own experiences in a local ward in Belgium had been much more politically diverse, and the corresponding understanding of women's roles seemed far too limiting. So what did she do? She went on to take her own survey of European Mormon women's experiences. She surveyed 60 women in 17 European countries. She mapped Mormon women's experiences and compared them to what she had encountered in the US. She noted striking differences in life choices in which European Mormon women conform more closely to other European women's choices than to US Mormon norms. European saints tend to marry later and delay childbirth for a few years after marriage, focusing instead on gaining education before motherhood. They also continue to work outside the home, often by choice after they've had children. In fact, the employment rate of Mormon women in Europe was even higher than European averages. De Koe van Velkenhuizen reasoned that European female saints pursue work not just for economic reasons, but to feel involved socially in their communities. In most countries, generous health care, parental leave policies, and child support make a balance of work and family life easier, and European women expressed a like for this level of support. Some, she reported, are openly critical of what they perceive to be anti-family policies in the US. The lessening of gender distinctions in work and family life also appear to carry over into church responsibilities and theology. Many European Mormons felt that gender equality is already a given in European countries, so that there is no need to fight for it. And they report that women already enjoy healthy participation in decision-making in their local wards. Most don't want to hold priesthood, and as in the US, a number of them rationalize that men need it more than they do. But they tend to minimize the theological significance of gender difference. They also tend to be critical of what they see as the American emphasis on modesty in dress, the, quote, odd dating and courtship patterns here, and the lack of robust sex education for young people, to which they attribute the higher rates of teen pregnancy, births, and abortions that are much higher in the US. Other research on European Mormons reinforce this data. Wilfried de Koe estimates that perhaps only 10 to 15% of European membership lives in traditional Mormon family arrangements. He attributes this in part to family disruptions caused by conversion, as well as the lack of a surrounding Mormon culture that makes it more difficult to keep children in the faith. The question then of what Mormon women's experience can and should look like in Europe is intriguing. The correlation movement that was intended to make the church less American by paring down the gospel message to its essential elements is still, to de Koe's way of thinking, filled with American ideals and behaviors that aren't recognized as such. In many parts of Europe, the initial organizers of branches and wards are white middle-class Americans, and they bring with them American advice on dating, sex, and grooming. For women, these differences have particular salience, since their own sense of what it means to gain agency or self-reliance can be very much at odds with church teachings for women. This isn't simply true in Europe, however. Other culture-specific forms of women's authority and agency may come into conflict with church guidance, and do in other places. This is even true in places in the global south, where more conservative gender roles often are welcomed. Remember our woman in Ghana, who was delighted with the ways the church was helping her family to conform to fairly traditional patterns. Her main concern was not to shift roles, but to school her husband in how to be a better husband and father. But when the LDS Church first entered Ghana, it bumped up against a society in which women also engaged in other kinds of spiritual leadership alongside the role of wife and mother. Beginning in the early 1960s, some Ghanaians, armed with the Book of Mormon and a few instructional manuals, began to form religious communities and take the name of the LDS Church for their own. It was only after 1978, with the lifting of the ban on temple participation for peoples of African descent, that the Utah Church began to send missionaries to West Africa. So if you look in the archives, you'll see files of people in Ghana who keep writing back to the church saying, please send us missionaries. Please send us instructional manuals. And you see these letters back sort of hedging the issue and saying, well, we really can't send you missionaries quite yet, but here are some books for you. So they got the books, but not the missionaries until about 1979. Before that time, in the absence of oversight, these small churches tried as they could to adapt Mormon practices to their own setting. This led to some really interesting hybrid churches and practices. Perhaps the most unusual was a church led by a woman named Rebecca Mould, who was known to her followers as Prophetess Rebecca. Her leadership in this regard conformed to traditional patterns of women's authority in southern Ghanaian society. The first constitution of this new eclectic Mormon church in 1969 makes no mention of gender differences in terms of the priesthood. And women in this church and others like it led prayer groups and performed ritual cleansings and baptisms for both male and female congregants. At times, female authority was questioned. In 1972, male leaders discussed the proposal to bar women from giving revelations and prophecies. They did not pursue this option, as it turned out, but instead instructed that dreams and revelations had to be reported to the pastor. Still, Prophetess Rebecca was elected to a national high council of 12 apostles in 1972 with no dissent. When the LDS missionaries arrived and set about regulating church practices, they had to deal with the problem of Prophetess Rebecca, who also happened to own the building in which the church met. Meeting minutes and journals reveal a delicate process of negotiation. Initially, Rebecca welcomed the LDS missionaries and was one of the first baptized into the young church. President Spencer W. Kimball sent along a special commendation to her, and she was set apart as Relief Society president. Her title was changed to Mother Rebecca. I think this went along with the rationale given to her that the idea was that men hold the priesthood and women are mothers. So she was given the honorific of mother. Although many followers continued to call her a prophetess, and she continued to occupy a prime seat in the front of the meeting house. In fact, she insisted on being seated on the dais. Still, the efforts to nudge her out of a position of spiritual authority began to chafe, and her leadership became less visible over time. The missionaries explained to her that the baptized she had originally performed were not valid. When the missionaries departed in late 1979, arguments broke out in the church as several male members tried to convince her to donate her building to the church. When she refused, she was accused of abusing the presidency, and soon thereafter she left the church to reclaim the title of independent church leader. This is when she falls out of the official history from the church. While her role as Prophetess Rebecca was distinct, the circumstances surrounding her departure suggest that she was far from alone in wanting to retain women's authority in the church. Her sister, Comfort Mould, had already split away and formed her own charismatic congregation. When Rebecca left the LDS Church, she took a substantial number of her followers with her and continued to use LDS church materials. She still considers herself a Mormon. Quote, "The Lord knows that I am a Mormon. In my heart, I'm a Mormon. I'm a Latter-day Saint," unquote. Now, this culturally specific form of women's religious authority continues to exist alongside and not necessarily in tension with very traditional models of womanhood. In Ghanaian society, both seem to be acknowledged and respected. Even Prophetess Rebecca's former church members who stayed in the LDS fold still acknowledge her as a healer and prophetess and continue to visit her every so often to pay their respects. Similarly, the Maori Mormons of New Zealand hold to patterns of leadership, or rangatira, tied to prophetic gifts within their communities that can be held by men or women. Those patterns still persist alongside membership in the Mormon Church. And there's much to explore in the ways that Maori Mormon women understand their own gendered identities. Finally, I want to present one more example of Mormon women's experience that presents a different set of challenges as we expand this map. This case study may also be predictive of future issues to come as populations become more mobile, less fixed to national geographies or boundaries, such that it becomes challenging even to figure out what a culture, and thus women's experience, looks like. From her vantage point in Hong Kong, Stacey Ford has begun to trace a community of what she calls flexible citizens, groups of mobile inhabitants that give rise to entirely new communities linked to transnational Asian capitalism. In these settings, economic necessities fundamentally reshape individual and family identities, as transnational flows of people, goods, and capital create Mormon wards in China, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and many other metropolitan centers, made up of multiple worlds. Melissa Inoue has written poignantly about the challenges of flexible citizenship, a vantage that allows her to see into many notes that flexible citizenship is not a one-size-fits-all designation. Inhabitants range from upwardly mobile and highly educated workers following jobs in finance or marketing to domestic workers living on very little means, who are technically not considered citizens at all. One district, the Hong Kong China district, will serve as an example. In this area, domestic workers comprise the majority of the church membership. They are migrant workers, with most coming from the Philippines, but some others from Indonesia, Thailand, and Nepal. Ford notes that it is, quote, arguably among the most gender imbalanced entity of its type in the LDS Church anywhere in the world, unquote. Approximately 75% of the 1,800 members are women, and roughly 1,000 of those make their living as domestic workers. It is hard to overstate the disparities between the life led by these women and those of other Asian expats, not to mention North American Latter-day Saints. These workers present a particular challenge in a church committed to specific ideals of what constitutes family. Their migration was typically compelled by high unemployment and social instability in their home countries. In Hong Kong, they live with their employers in variable conditions. Quite often they sleep on the floor, in closets, or even in bathtubs, for which they are paid less than the Hong Kong minimum wage. Much more could be said about the material circumstances and their distance from gendered norms of family life. But Ford's point is that at the local level, the church adapts to the gender disparities and working hours of these women. They occupy more decision-making roles than would be common among women in Utah, for example, and they are set apart for roles that would otherwise be occupied by priesthood holders. The Hong Kong temple opens on Sundays once per quarter to accommodate different work schedules. In other words, local leaders improvise to meet the needs of a woman's church in this setting. But Ford also observes matters in which church leadership has been reluctant to flex. She concludes by urging readers to, quote, consider the ways in which culturally bound LDS ideals of motherhood and fatherhood, manhood and womanhood, family and patriarchy may constrain rather than empower, unquote. Transnational families are quickly becoming the norm in many parts of the world, a fact that will continue to shape women's experiences in the LDS Church. Now, looking back on this quick global tour of a woman's church is both dizzying and challenging. And I think it's understandable in this respect that one response is simply to retrench, to emphasize the traditional standard of norms for women's lives, and to urge church members to strive as best they can to hit the mark. This is the approach taken, as I've previously suggested, by groups like United Families International and Latter-day Saint Women Stand. But there are other options, as this paper tries to point out. One, so well expressed by Melissa Inouye in her work on church practices in Asia and New Zealand, focuses on the interplay between church doctrines and creative improvisation in local settings. As she puts it, Mormonism is administered centrally, but experienced locally. Now, this may entail the capacity of church leaders to, quote, look the other way at specific details, and there will always be disagreements by how much improvisation is acceptable. But the first step is that of listening to the cacophony of women's voices, even if they can't all be celebrated at the same time. Increasingly, women in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are following the paths of Elaine Jack, Cheiko Okazaki, and Eileen Clyde in just documenting the diversity, even if absorbing or explaining it doesn't immediately follow. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to tell one more story that I find extraordinarily arresting, both for what it says about sort of expectations for women, and both of the kind of sort of power of decision-making that can be unleashed in this environment, and perhaps not knowing what lies on the other end of women's decision-making is what is so fearful to some parts of the church at other times. You just don't know what you're going to get or what people are going to decide to do. And I think that's what this story might help us understand. It's the story of Mariama Callan, a refugee from the wars in Sierra Leone. Callan grew up Muslim, and her life in no way conformed to idealized family norms. Because education was not easy for a young woman to secure, she left her immediate family back in the village and grew up in Freetown with extended family members. She hardly knew her parents or knew where they were at any given time since they moved from place to place. She was entirely dependent on teachers and distant relations for housing, and she suffered beating and sexual abuse at the hands of others. The 11-year civil war in her country further disrupted any semblance of steady home life. Her parents and siblings died in the violence. Eventually, she found the LDS Church, and she describes feeling drawn to its quiet and to the soft voice of a woman speaking from a blue book, offering promises that the spirit and the body would someday be reunited. Quote, "Those were the most beautiful and liberating words I had ever heard. It seemed almost too good to be possible. The thought that my parents, brother, and sister could be made whole again overwhelmed me. I felt hope, and that hope was connected to the blue book with Jesus Christ on the cover. And when the teacher then taught that we could, by our actions and obedience, choose to be with our families forever, I knew I had to be a part of this church." Unquote. Callan describes the many attractions of the church: its focus on agency and individual control, its teachings on equality of the sexes and improved behavior for men towards their families, its focus on education for women, and on women attaining leadership in church callings. Soon, Callan moved to the U.S. to start a new life. But her story doesn't end quite the way one might imagine. There is no fairy tale wedding in the temple. She continues, quote, "At some point after I moved to America, my friends started to ask, 'Why are you staying single? Why can't you just have a man and make American babies?' But because I have this church in my life, I know that I do not have to make that choice. I don't need that kind of man. More and more of my Sierra Leonean sisters are realizing the same thing. The gospel gives them the knowledge and confidence they need to say no to the people who would tell them to endure beatings and infidelity instead of loneliness. We are choosing to wait and pray and live our lives because we know that things need to be equal, and we will not settle for less." Unquote. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Appreciate that very much. We do have a few minutes for questions. We have one roving microphone, so Laurie, if you're willing to take questions from the podium,
Sure.
we'd just ask that you wait for the microphone to arrive and that you state your question succinctly. And the third rule, which some of you know, is it must be a question, right? So with that in mind, we'll open it up.
No throwing vegetables or anything.
Hi, I appreciated your presentation a lot. I'm curious, with the influx of more Latter-day Saint sister missionaries in the previous 10 years, how you view that changing the sort of American versus broadly international experiences that are going to be reflected both in the American church and abroad?
That's a great question. I've read some oral histories taken by women in Ghana in the missionary training center, and they're women from all over Africa, in fact. It's hard to know, though, because in part I'm still trying to figure out how the church makes decisions about who goes where. I think there are some unwritten rules there that I just either don't understand or I haven't figured out who to ask for the answers yet. But so, for example, I was told that white American women cannot be missionaries in Ghana. I asked like 6 people why, and no one seemed to know the answer, even the president of the missionary training center. So there's some rules about this that are still in play in various ways. So it's not a free-for-all. Like everyone's not going everywhere, but it's bound to change the shape of things in some ways. I think what's hard seems to me that the issue isn't just more diversity, getting more women out there to say more, to talk more. It's making sure that there are lines of communication going in all directions. So it's not just a unidirectional, sort of coming down from Utah to other places, but there is some kind of dialogue coming back. That's hard. That's a hard pattern to change, right? And it's a result. It's in some ways, in terms of the life of the church, such a recent phenomenon, this worldwide church, that you kind of see the church, I can imagine sort of leadership trying to race to catch up with demographically what the church has become.
Laurie, thank you very much. That was compelling. You talked in detail, relative detail, about the diversity in Hong Kong, the national diversity. My question is about Europe. It's my understanding that already in Europe you have such a diversity of nationalities in the church there.
Right, especially the cities.
Right, so I guess my question is, what is your understanding of the state of research about that? How much are we making any progress or angling towards understanding just what it means to be a global church in kind of an already globalized European environment?
That's a great question, because I've heard lots of anecdotal evidence about that. So people I knew who had been in particular wards in London where it was mostly people from Africa and the Caribbean who were church members there. I don't know of studies, and there are people here who probably know more than I do about some of this and about how oral history is, you oral historians and such. But I know that the church is doing its own kind of collecting of testimonies, but I find them honestly to not be very helpful most of the time, because often they're given by missionary couples who they're not trained oral historians. They're told to ask a certain set of questions, and my fear is that often they get back what people think they're supposed to be telling them, rather than I don't know if I'm looking for authentic voices here, but something that gives a little more texture to their experience. And I found most of them, frankly, in the women's oral history project stuff. So shout out to all those women who have been involved in that. But it's a great question. I hope someone's working on it. There's a conference coming up at the end of this month in France on global Mormonism, and I'm hoping I think the more sort of networks of people connect around the world, the more we're going to find out what's going on in all these other places.
question is, you referenced very briefly
Yeah.
the impact of correlation
Yeah.
on the spread of the church. And my question is, if you were to advise, had an opportunity to provide counsel and advice, how would you recommend that the church go forward in disentangling doctrine from American culture?
Oh, wow. You know, I'm a historian. I feel I'm not, I can diagnose things. I'm not very good at offering a cure. You know, because I have also studied other religious traditions, in some ways I see this as a perennial problem, right? This is, in all missionary contexts, Protestant, Catholic, other types of missionaries have tried to figure out, how do you distill the essence of our religion from the, you know, the peripheral stuff, the stuff we can do away with. Is it possible? I don't know if it's possible. And of course, then there are churches that have gone the other way, the Catholic Church, and said, okay, do what you want to do in your own countries. You can worship in your homes, and you can worship these little statues, or have whatever kinds of home shrines you want. And we're just not. It's sort of a don't ask, don't tell kind of policy. I think, you know, the LDS Church is struggling with this, right? Because there is this focus on this global vision of Zion, and how you can have a global vision without having uniformity is the challenge here. And people are always going to argue. I mean, my opinion, people are always going to argue about this. You have to develop a process for conversation that's going to allow different voices to be heard, if not always fully honored. The UN. It's the UN model of religious growth.
Quick question. We've heard a lot of experiences and statistics on the European side.
Yep.
But I was wondering if you have any outtake on islanders or on the Polynesian side of it.
So you want, what kind of statistics do you want? Like surveys of women's roles?
Yeah, you said women would experience from the European, and I know quite a bit of islanders that are very strong in that faith, and so I was just wondering if there's any experience on that.
I don't have more than much anecdotal evidence about that question. I don't know that anyone has done any contemporary surveys. You know, the problems are very different, because the cultures are very different in those places. So, you know, in some places like Samoa or Tonga, when you have sort of practically a majority of the population is Mormon, you have much more of a Mormon culture forming. And that's going to have effects, I think, on how embedded people feel in groups, larger networks that share their religious beliefs. But there's also the sort of the political anti-colonial pushback that's come in the Pacific world. So in New Zealand, New Zealand is a prime example of that. Auckland, New Zealand has the largest population of Pacifica peoples of any place in the world. And it's a very politicized issue because when the Mormon Church first came into New Zealand and other parts of Polynesia, it was an anti-colonial church in some ways. It sort of poised itself as a third way, as opposed to British or French colonizers or sort of indigenous ways. And for many Maori Mormons, they see it as a way to preserve their culture. Mormonism has preserved their native cultures in the face of colonial destruction. But that then causes problems when the Mormon Church itself has started to change, and correlation comes into this too, because then they want to say, no more facial tattooing. We're not doing that anymore. No more long funeral services, that you're used to doing. So there are tensions that have arisen in that environment, but it's a very different situation than the European situation. I wouldn't even know how to begin to compare them statistically. I don't know if that's more just anecdotal evidence for you, but I could talk a lot about New Zealand if you want. So could you. Hi.
Do you or anyone else have access to the research conducted by Presidents Clyde, Okazaki, and Jack?
Great question. I haven't seen it. Clyde, Colleen McDaniel did some interviewing with Eileen Clyde, I know, and there's some stuff at the U in Salt Lake sort of that deals with that. I don't know. Have you looked at any of that, Joseph? Yeah. 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 I thought there, but she has an oral history collection at the U. Right. 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 Yeah. From Colleen's book. Yeah, it's. But I think no. There, did Eileen Clyde talk about it to me? No, no, I didn't talk to Eileen Clyde about this. But there is a video of Eileen Clyde on YouTube. I think I can get you the where she's talking about this. What was that? Yeah. So she has given talks about this in public settings. Yep. Yeah, there are lots of experts in this audience. So. Please. She can't remember what it was called. Yeah. Can we mic her? Yeah. Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah, since you brought up that, I think it's a really important point too about women's narratives and discourses, because Eileen, after all those years of working so hard within the system and within her position in the Relief Society presidency, finally it was how many years later, almost 20 years later, she spoke at Claremont at this conference that Claudia and others had organized, and that was the first time she had come out and told the story and confessed publicly. And it's a really important video that people should watch, because she's quite honest and quite blunt about her feelings and her frustrations, and really calling out the leadership for what they did to the Relief Society. So it was a critical moment in her journey and her discourse and her story.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just to add to that, you know, I just sort of stumbled on the speeches that they actually gave at the Relief Society conference itself in 1995, thinking, oh, I wonder if they sort of tried to intimate that there were issues, and it was everywhere. I mean, it was very veiled, as you noted in Cheiko Okazaki's talk, veiled in a way, but she still named all the things she wanted to name. Right? But
Eileen is still talking about it. She did a fireside chat for Mormon Women for Ethical Government.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
A year ago, about a year ago, and talked very forthrightly about that whole time.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate that on the mic. After that moment at Claremont, which seemed to be the time when she decided to come out publicly and say what she really had felt, then since then, you're right, she has been reiterating that since then. But I had a quick comment about Prophetess Rebecca,
Yeah.
and I really appreciate the cultural examples you used in this talk to really deconstruct and to broaden out what Mormon women are, who they are, and how it's culturally situated, and their identities are culturally constructed. But Prophetess Rebecca is such an important deconstructive example, not to dehumanize her, but what an amazing person. And several of us have known about her, and yet her story has never really been brought home to the American Mormon audience the way it needs to be. But she embodies 3 or 4 major tensions: the tension between the institutional and the charismatic,
Right.
the tension between African culture and American culture, the tension between gender, male privilege and female privilege, and then especially the tension between 19th century Mormon women's authority versus 20th century. So the historical tension of the fact that Prophetess Rebecca was actually intuiting without knowing. She's recovering Mormon women's history and Mormon women's authority intuitively and charismatically without knowing that 19th century Mormon's history supports and verifies what she was doing. Everything except the baptisms. But being the prophetess, leading, sitting at the front, I mean, everything she's doing, the precedent is there in 19th century. So I just kind of wanted to hear you comment on that a little bit more about how we could, especially with the historical tension that she embodies, how we could bring a narrative like that home better so that people would know about this.
Right.
It's devastating to think of what happened to her.
Yeah.
And there she was recovering Mormon women's history and authority, so
Yeah.
intuitively, charismatically.
Yeah. How do you make a movie about it? I don't know. Just to sort of get people, it would be a fascinating movie. It's hard to get. It is hard to. At least it's been hard for me to get access to all the things in the archives because there are a lot of oral histories surrounding that are, restricted in various sorts of ways. But there's plenty there in the meeting minutes, in the transcript of Billy Johnson, who was one of the first converts, talking about her. You see it, and you can get a pretty good sense for the kind of the struggles. I mean, I love the meeting minutes where they say, Mother Rebecca wanted to sit on the dais, and we really had to let her sit up there. This sort of tentative questioning, but you can sort of see the lines changing and people trying to negotiate these boundaries in different sorts of ways. I'd love to see a book about her, but I don't know that there's enough. I wish I knew what happened to her beyond Billy Johnson saying, we used to. I think it was 2005, the interview where he was still saying we still go visit her. She's a prophetess. Yes, she didn't quite get the priesthood thing. She didn't have a testimony of the priesthood. That's the way they put it. She didn't have a testimony of the priesthood, but she had it all. Everything else was great. So they still revered her in a certain kind of way, but wouldn't let her, work in the church the way she wanted to work. So.
Just a quick question for you. You had mentioned asking several of the church leaders questions about their direction of where the missionaries are sent.
Yeah.
But you didn't say what the response was. Were they not able to give you one? Or were they able to redirect you to someone else you could ask?
So I think the problem was the people that I was asking at that point were not the people who had the answers to that question. So when I was in Ghana, I was asking about that because I noticed that there were no American women. No. Did I ask if no, because I knew I was coming back to Salt Lake, and I figured I'd get better answers here eventually. But I haven't quite figured out where to go for those answers yet, or whether people will be willing to talk about it. So.
Laurie, just a quick thought.
Yeah.
Perhaps, would you comment on this? Would it be valuable if it is culturally situated, if women's roles are, as was stated so eloquently, culturally situated, do we need a more differentiated sense of the American Mormon women's culture that names more things than the connection with right-wing this or Republican that? Would that be helpful in understanding more of what you're trying to draw?
Oh, absolutely.
Bring attention to.
Yeah, I mean, people have people talk about historians as falling into two camps, either lumpers or splitters, and I'm definitely a splitter. So I like to just divide things up. Oh, that's distinctive. That's everything's different when you really can boil down to it. But yeah, there are lots of things that I left out of this talk because I was trying to focus outside the U.S., but I think there are all kinds of issues around women of color, Native American women, in all kinds of ways there are variations. Utah, I've never lived in Utah until this semester, so my full immersion into sort of Mormon culture is now complete. But I know Mormon women where I used to live in North Carolina who would say, I never want to live in Utah. For them it would feel stifling. On the other hand, other people I know are always trying to get back here because this is home. And so there are all kinds of variations, I think, in women's and men's responses to sort of cultural expectations, that need to be explored. I think that, the hard thing is just that as an institution, the church, for understandable reasons, this is what institutions do, has really tried to create sort of that aspirational ideal. But the realities, I think, are changing so quickly on the ground. They've always been, there's always been a distance between them. But there are ways in which the demographics of the church have changed so quickly and so dramatically that it's really forcing the issue in new kinds of ways, I think.
Laurie, I want to thank you very much on behalf of everyone here. You. Just a quick note that we are back tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock in this room, right? We're going until 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. We're live streaming as well, but we would much prefer seeing you live and in person. So until then, be well. Thank you.